Welcome. So good to be with you on this Wednesday as we get together for a little midweek Bible study and devotional time. So glad you've taken some time out of your day, out of your week to join us to dive into God's word and hopefully be uplifted and encouraged and challenged by what he has to say to us. When we go through things in our lives, we experience things happen in our lives, whether it be good or bad. Maybe it's a challenge, or maybe it's an opportunity, maybe it's a setback, whatever it may be. It's easy in the moment of when we're going through those things and that particular instance or circumstance or whatever it may be, challenge, setback. It's easy to, in the moment, think that something is just a coincidence, right? It's just happenstance. It just happened to be this way. It just happened to turn out this way. It just happened to work this way, like those particular moments. But then when we look back, it's often much easier to see how things were actually all working together and fitting like the pieces of a puzzle, or to be more specific, to see how God was working them together and working all things together for a particular reason and purpose. And perhaps no person, especially in the Bible, exemplifies this better than a young woman by the name of Esther. We find her story in the Old Testament book that has her name attached to it. That's the name of the book of Esther. So I'd encourage you to go back and read her story. We're not going to go through all of it because it's several chapters long and we don't have the time to dig into all of it. But if you're not familiar with her, even if you are, go back and read the story again, but especially if you're not. But just to summarize, she was an orphan. She was a foreigner. Her people had been captured and conquered and taken to a foreign, distant land, and her parents had passed away after seemingly staying there in that land, and so she's an orphan and she's a foreigner in a land. The only person she's really got is a cousin by the name of Mordecai, who takes her in and she's living with him. And in the end, she ends up becoming an unlikely queen as well. And yet, when she's in this position, she's this unlikely queen chosen from among many other women at the time. And how she gets there is an interesting story. Again, I'd encourage you to go back and read that. But yet, she gets to be in this position of influence and power as the queen. And yet, when her people, the Israelites, were threatened with annihilation through a series of events and maneuvers by this man named Haman, who was an enemy of his people, were an enemy of the Jews, her people face annihilation again, and she is faced with a decision. Would she step forward in faith and go before the king and ask for his intervention, which in doing so would risk her life? Or would she remain in comfort and luxury in the palace and yet be silent? And her cousin Mordecai charges her with these well-known words that many of you, if you're familiar with the story, probably know in Esther chapter 4, verse 14. And who knows, Esther, who knows, but that you have come to your royal position, that everything in your life that's happened up to this point has brought you to this place for such a time as this. And not unlike Esther, you and I are also faced with our for such a time as this moments and times in our lives, moments and times when we are placed by God in a specific moment with a specific purpose. The question is, will we recognize and respond to his calling? You see, for Esther, she didn't choose to be queen. She didn't plan to be in a position of influence, but God had placed her there for a specific purpose and reason. And for us, there may be circumstances in our lives that we may not fully see, we may not fully understand. In fact, we may not even fully want or like, but they may be part of God's bigger plan. And I think it's important for us to remember that God doesn't make mistakes. If you're here, if you are where you are in this time and in this place, wherever you are, it is for a reason. God has a reason and a purpose for you. And Esther, when Mordecai told her to go before the king, she actually hesitated at first. And in that culture, entering the king's presence uninvited could mean death. I mentioned earlier that it was a risk to her life. It truly was. There were two things that you didn't do in the king that were above everything else. One, you didn't not come when he called you. And secondly, as Esther is confronted with, you didn't come when he didn't call you before him. And so she had a choice. Would she let fear rule her, or would she step forward in faith? And oftentimes, fear for us, just like it was for Esther, is the main factor that holds us back from stepping into God's plan and purposes for our lives. We're often more focused on what we might lose than what we might gain, and ultimately what God might gain by working in us and through us. But faith means trusting that God is bigger than our fears. Now, if Esther had stayed silent, maybe she could have continued to live in luxury and comfort. But as Mordecai reminded her, comfort is not the goal, and it's not the goal for us either. Obedience is the goal. And many of us are tempted by, in our lives, this default mission. God's got a purpose, He's got a plan, and yet there's a default mission. Just drifting through life, or maybe chasing success, or going after comfort and security, whatever it may be. But God calls us to something greater. And so the question is, are we living with intentionality? Are we living for God's purposes that He has for our lives? Or are we just going through the motion in our lives? And to Esther's credit, despite her fears and despite her hesitation, in the end, she didn't just acknowledge the need, she took action. She fasted, she prayed, and then boldly approached the king. And likewise, answering God's call requires us stepping out in faith as well. It might mean speaking up when it's easier to stay silent. It might mean serving where you feel unqualified. It might mean trusting God when the future and the path seems uncertain and you don't know where it's going to lead. But whatever it is, what is one step of faith that you need to take today, trusting in God's purpose and plan and leading in your life? You know, Mordecai told Esther in the same verse that we looked at in verse 14, just a few words earlier. He said, he said to her, if you remain silent, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. He says, Esther, God's put you in this moment for this. But relief and deliverance will arise from another place. In other words, God's plan will move forward with or without you, Esther, with or without you, whoever you are that's listening to this, and with or without me. But when we say yes to His call, we get to be a part of His greater story and experience greater blessings than we could ever imagine. It may not be easy, but it will be worth it. So may God give us the courage and the strength to step out in faith and to answer the call that He has placed on our lives for such a time as this. Hope you have a blessed day. God bless.